Soft piano music plays under a slow zoom on an old black and white portrait. A couple dressed in elegant Victorian clothing looks calmly at the camera. Nothing in their expressions hints at the nightmare hidden beneath their lives. This photograph was taken in the autumn of 1864 in the small industrial town of Harrogate, northern England. At first glance, the couple in the picture could have been anyone, a merchant and his wife, perhaps, or members of a respectable congregation. But the story behind those faces is one that would stain the ground they walked upon for generations. Eleanor Whitmore rose before dawn each morning, as respectable ladies of her class were expected to do. She dressed in heavy wool, fastened her dark hair in a tight bun, and descended the creaking staircase of the Whitmore house with the same quiet precision she had repeated for years. She warmed the kettle, set out china cups with gold filigree, and arranged sugar cubes with neat fingers. Thomas Whitmore came down shortly after, adjusting his waistcoat, a man of punctual habits. He was known to read the Morning Gazette before breakfast, holding the paper so straight it seemed as though any crease would offend his sense of order. To their neighbors, the Whitmores were the embodiment of good Victorian values, discipline, generosity, and religious devotion. They rarely missed a Sunday service. They made regular donations to the parish charity fund. And most importantly, they opened their home to children without families. The Industrial Revolution had transformed England into a land of smoke and machinery. Cities swelled with workers, disease spread easily, and thousands of children were left orphaned by poverty, accidents, or epidemics. The sight of a young boy in torn clothes begging at the corner or a girl sleeping in the soutenier factories was not uncommon. In such a world, the Whitmores' generosity shone like a lantern in the fog. Neighbors often spoke of them with admiration. "Bless their hearts," said Mrs. Partridge, the baker's wife, when she saw another orphan led gently by the hand through the Whitmore gates. "No one in Harrogate has done more for those poor children," replied the vicar on Sunday mornings. And why wouldn't they believe it? The Whitmores had the perfect reputation. They had never been involved in scandal. Their property was well maintained, their manners impeccable, and their intentions seemed pure. Eleanor was especially beloved among the parish women. She organized charity teas, read Bible passages to small groups of orphans, and always wore a soft smile. Her hands were delicate, and her voice gentle, making even the most frightened child lower their guard. Thomas, on the other hand, was a quiet man, but dependable. He kept careful records of donations and was often seen escorting children through town with a hand on their shoulder, like a father figure. The house itself stood just beyond the main road, its red brick facade softened by climbing ivy. Tall iron gates separated it from the noise of the factories nearby. To passers-by, it looked like a haven, a place where abandoned children might finally be safe. But behind that picturesque image, subtle things went unnoticed. The Whitmores never allowed visitors beyond the main parlor or the front garden. Neighbors could describe Eleanor's roses in exquisite detail, but none could recall seeing the back half of the property. The windows of the upper floor were always shuttered. The laughter of children, heard in their first days, never seemed to last more than a week or two. Occasionally, curious townsfolk would ask what had become of a child they'd seen. Eleanor always had an answer. "Oh, Martha? She's gone to live with a fine family in London. Jacob found work on a farm up north. He's thriving. And a distant aunt took her in." The stories sounded perfectly ordinary for the time. Victorian England was a place where children were routinely sent away, to workhouses, to relatives, to distant farms. No one had the means to track them once they left. Paperwork was minimal. People disappeared every day, and life went on. Eleanor and Thomas understood that better than anyone. Their reputation became their shield. The more they were praised, the less anyone questioned them. Inside the house, away from the admiring eyes of neighbors, Eleanor kept a meticulous leather-bound journal on a small desk in the corner of her bedroom. Each page bore a child's name, date of arrival, age, and a brief description. Martha, 6. Small, thin brown curls. Jacob, 8. Quiet. And bright eyes. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for a list of children she had helped. But between those lines lay something much darker. Every act of kindness they displayed was part of a mask carefully constructed over years. A performance, flawless and convincing. And it worked. No one in Harrogate suspected what really happened behind those closed doors. No one imagined that the children who entered the Whitmore house would never leave again. The Whitmore's reputation was a fortress. For years, no one dared to look too closely at their charitable work. When children vanished from their home, people assumed they had simply moved on to new lives, as was common in Victorian England. Orphans were constantly shuffled from one place to another: farms, factories, distant relatives, workhouses. It was a society where the poor left few footprints. The disappearances began subtly. The first child, Martha, had arrived at the Whitmore house in the early spring of 1862. She was 6 years old, thin from malnutrition but with the determined eyes of a survivor. For weeks, neighbors saw her walking in the front garden, holding Eleanor's hand. She wore a second-hand blue dress that had been carefully patched, and she always carried a small stuffed rabbit missing one ear. Then one morning Martha was gone. Eleanor explained that a wealthy family in London had taken her in. They wanted a little girl to raise as their own, she said with a warm smile. I was overjoyed for her. People believed it without hesitation. Why wouldn't they? Such adoptions happened often. Then it happened again. Jacob, 8 years old, had been taken in during the harvest season. A quiet boy, often seen sweeping the front steps or drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. One week he was there, the next he was not. Eleanor said he'd been sent to a farm in Yorkshire. He'll grow strong in the countryside, she said. He needed open air. Then came Anne. Then Samuel. Then little Clara, whose laughter had briefly filled the neighborhood. The pattern was always the same: weeks of visibility, then silence. Eleanor always had an explanation ready, delivered with calm, motherly authority. No one thought to question it. Not the neighbors, not the vicar, not the officials at the overcrowded orphanage who were just relieved to have one fewer mouth to feed. What no one saw was what happened behind the house. Eleanor's journal grew heavier with names. Each entry began with a description, the same careful, elegant handwriting. Clara, age 4. Golden hair. Easily frightened. Samuel, age 7. Resistant at first, now quiet. Anne, age 5. Sleeps restlessly. But after each description came a second notation, written more briefly, almost clinically. Departed. A date. Nothing more. Thomas's role was equally methodical. An accountant by profession, he understood structure, numbers, and patterns. He kept quiet during most of these exchanges, letting Eleanor handle the public performance. But late at night, when the lamps were dimmed and the town slept, he turned their charity into a calculation. He drew neat diagrams in his notebook, sketched maps of their land, and marked with tiny dots the places where each departure had occurred. Their explanations were always believable because they were rooted in reality. During the Victorian period, orphans were often placed in situations far from where they began. A child could be here one week and in a distant county the next, without papers, without questions. Mortality rates were high. A sick child might vanish and no one would record their death. A factory accident could swallow a life without leaving a trace. The Whitmores knew all of this. They thrived in the shadows of a system that valued the lives of the poor as little more than footnotes. Their home was not the only place where children disappeared, it was just the place where no one bothered to ask why. Some neighbors noticed small oddities but dismissed them. Mrs. Partridge, who lived across the lane, once mentioned to another woman that it was odd how quickly the little ones came and went. Her friend replied, "Eleanor does such good work, Mary. Don't go sowing doubts where they don't belong." Respectability carried more weight than suspicion. The most unsettling thing in hindsight was how quickly the memory of each child faded. After Martha disappeared, her name was rarely spoken. When Jacob vanished, no one asked what happened to the small stick figure drawings he had scratched into the stone by the gate. Their lives slipped away like smoke from a chimney, noticed for a moment, then gone. Inside the house, Eleanor grew increasingly meticulous in her record-keeping. Each name became a small, silent entry in her private history. She wrote with a strange detachment, as if she were documenting the growth of plants in a garden rather than the fate of living children. She underlined the word departed in some entries. In others, she left a small mark, a symbol known only to her. Thomas complimented her coldness with precision. He calculated how many adoptions they could manage without attracting attention. He noted how long each child stayed before neighbors might begin to wonder. Their cruelty was not impulsive. It was planned, rehearsed, and repeated. The town continued to praise them. "The Whitmores have helped so many," the vicar said in his sermon one Sunday. "Their generosity is an example to us all." Applause filled the pews. Not one person imagined that beneath that mask of charity, an unthinkable darkness was growing. Every disappearance was a test of how much the world would allow to go unnoticed. And every time no one asked questions, Eleanor and Thomas became bolder. Their mask of kindness was working. No one suspected a thing. Autumn settled heavily over Harrogate. The fog rolled in from the river at dusk, thick and pale, blurring the outlines of houses and turning the gas lamps into halos. It was in this fog that the first whispers began, faint at first, drifting like smoke between conversations, never quite daring to take form. Mrs. Partridge, the baker's wife, was the first to say it aloud. She was standing outside her shop early one morning, her shawl pulled tight, watching the Whitmore house through the mist. "Strange, isn't it?" she said softly to her husband, "how many children they take in, and how few I've ever seen grow up." He told her not to speak nonsense. "Eleanor and Thomas are good people. The vicar says so. Best not to stir trouble." But the thought lingered. A few weeks later, two factory workers mentioned something similar while walking home after the night shift. They had seen a lantern flickering in the Whitmores' back garden well past midnight. One of them, a man named Henry Black, swore he'd heard a faint cry, a sound quickly smothered by the wind. "Probably one of the children," his friends said uneasily. "Maybe they were ill." But neither of them looked back. Whispers have a way of growing without ever being shouted. They slip through cracks in conversations, carried by the idle talk of markets, churchyards, and taverns. By the time winter crept in, a quiet unease had settled over a handful of people in town. And yet, no one confronted the Whitmores. Their reputation was too well built, their image too perfect. Eleanor still attended every Sunday service, greeting parishioners with warm smiles and clasping hands as if nothing were amiss. Thomas still nodded politely at the men in the marketplace, always punctual, always proper. Respectability, in Victorian England, was as strong as stone. Accusing someone of their standing was like striking the church itself. But the children's absences were becoming harder to ignore. A boy named Samuel had arrived at the Whitmores in early November. He was a thin, freckled child with restless hands, known for tapping his fingers on the iron fence. Neighbors saw him playing marbles in the front garden one chilly afternoon. By the time the snow began to fall, the marbles lay scattered in the mud. Samuel was gone. Eleanor told Mrs. Partridge that he'd been sent to a work placement in Leeds. Her tone was serene, but Mrs. Partridge noticed something strange in her eyes that day, a flash of irritation, quickly buried beneath a smile. Henry Black, the factory worker who'd heard the cry weeks earlier, found himself standing outside the Whitmores' gate one evening as the fog thickened. The house loomed above him, its windows shuttered as always. A faint light flickered behind the curtains on the upper floor. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure pressed against the glass, small, pale, and fleeting. He told no one. Men like Henry didn't make accusations against people like the Whitmores. Not without proof. Still, the whispers continued. "Have you noticed how quiet their house is lately?" one woman murmured in the churchyard. "Yes," another replied, "but children do come and go. It's always been that way." Silence usually followed such remarks, thick with unspoken fear. The town had learned to ignore discomfort. In an era when children vanished from factories, mines, and streets every day, their disappearances were as ordinary as the turning of the seasons. Poverty erased people quietly, and society pretended not to notice. The Whitmores were not just hiding behind their reputation, they were hiding behind the indifference of an entire era. There was one person, however, who began to truly wonder. Agnes Bell, a seamstress who lived 2 houses down, often worked late into the night by her upstairs window. One evening in January, she saw Thomas Whitmore carrying something heavy out toward the back of the property. He moved slowly, lantern in hand, the fog curling around him like smoke. She could not see what he carried, but she remembered the shape, long, still, and wrapped in fabric. She told herself it was probably nothing. Perhaps firewood. An old piece of furniture. She tried to turn back to her sewing, but the image wouldn't leave her. For the first time, someone in Harrogate truly wondered if something dreadful might be happening behind those shuttered windows. Agnes did not speak of it right away. To accuse the Whitmores would be to challenge the very order of the town. But something had shifted, a thin crack in the perfect facade. And once cracks appear, no matter how small, they have a way of growing. The whispers grew quieter then, but heavier. People began avoiding the Whitmore house at night, though none could say why. The fog seemed thicker near their gates, the silence too deep. It was all imagination, of course. Or at least, that's what everyone told themselves. Eleanor's smile never faltered. Thomas's routine never changed. But beneath the surface of Harrogate, unease had begun to stir, a low, quiet tremor that no one yet dared to name. By the spring of 1865, Harrogate seemed quieter than usual. It wasn't a silence born of peace but of something else, something heavier, like the weight that settles in a room after a terrible secret has been spoken but not acknowledged. Life went on as it always had. The mills roared during the day, the church bells rang on Sundays, and market chatter filled the square. But around the Whitmore house, conversations faltered. Laughter softened to whispers. Footsteps quickened at night. The children had continued to disappear. Samuel was not the last. 2 others, Alice, age 7, and Peter, just 5, had arrived at the Whitmore home with nothing but a small bundle of belongings tied in cloth. They were seen briefly in the front garden, Alice clutching Peter's hand, both wide-eyed and silent. A month later, they were gone. Eleanor explained, as she always did, that the children had been sent to good families. Her words were smooth, practiced, almost rehearsed. But something had changed in the way people received those words. Instead of nodding warmly, neighbors exchanged cautious glances. A few even asked timid questions. "Where exactly?" someone inquired one morning after service. Eleanor gave her most patient smile. "A lovely couple in Manchester," she replied. "They'll have a better life than I could ever give them." No one pressed further. No one ever did. The fog that often settled over Harrogate at dusk now seemed to gather thickest near the Whitmore house. It was superstition, of course. Fog was common in those parts. But people began to avoid walking too close to the tall iron gates after dark. Even children, who once played marbles near the fence, crossed the street instead. The silence around the house grew into a presence of its own. Inside the Whitmore home, the silence was cultivated deliberately. Eleanor had grown more exacting, more controlled. She moved through her halls with quiet authority, her skirts gliding over polished floors. The few remaining children inside the house were kept apart from the street, away from curious eyes. The windows upstairs remained shuttered, as they always had, and the curtains downstairs were drawn early each evening. Thomas had changed too. Once a quiet but ordinary man, he had become colder, efficient, mechanical. He no longer greeted neighbors with his faint nod. He walked the garden at night, inspecting the iron gate and the soil near the hedges with a lantern in hand. Agnes Bell, the seamstress who had once seen him carry something into the fog, watched from her window again. She noticed the way he paused at the far corner of the garden, the part hidden from the street, and how he always returned with his lantern dimmed. Eleanor's ledger had grown thicker. Page after page was filled with the careful, looping handwriting that had once been the pride of her schooling. Names, ages, dates of arrival. And always that single word beside each, departed. Some entries bore faint smudges where her pen had pressed harder than usual. Others had small symbols drawn in the margins, a private code no one but she understood. Outside their home, the town maintained its uneasy silence. No one reported anything. No one went to the authorities. In truth, there were few authorities to go to. The overworked parish officers and local constables had little time to worry over missing orphans. Children like Alice and Peter were unaccounted for every day in England, swept aside by the machinery of poverty and indifference. In such a world, the Whitmores thrived. Still, small ripples disturbed the surface. Henry Black, the factory worker, mentioned one evening at the tavern that he'd heard something again, a sound like a muffled cry carried on the wind. The other men at the table grew uncomfortable. "Best not to talk about that place," one muttered. Another added, "You'll make trouble for yourself." Their words were meant as a warning, but underneath lay something else: fear. Agnes, who had remained silent since the night she'd seen Thomas in the garden, felt the same fear tightening around her. But each passing day made her unease harder to ignore. The town's polite silence was beginning to feel like complicity. She would sit by her sewing table at night, hands stilling over the fabric, and listen to the wind. Sometimes, if the breeze was right, she thought she heard faint, distant sounds from the Whitmore property. A door creaking, a sob. Or perhaps it was only her imagination, though she could no longer convince herself entirely of that. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued her routine as if nothing were amiss. She organized charity teas, brought pastries to the church, and visited the parish orphanage to select new children to take in. Her composure was flawless, almost unnervingly so. The few who tried to look her in the eye when they asked about the missing children found only a calm, unwavering gaze in return. It was as if she truly believed the stories she told. Spring gave way to early summer, and with it came the first real tension in Harrogate. A boy named Thomas Reed, who lived near the bakery, went missing on his way home from the mill. He was not an orphan. His absence could not be dismissed with a simple story of adoption or work placement. Whispers turned sharper. People started watching the Whitmore house with more than idle curiosity. Some even walked slower when passing, their eyes drawn to the shuttered windows. The silence that had protected Eleanor and Thomas for so long was beginning to crack. Not yet loudly, not enough to bring the law to their door, but enough for the air to grow colder, even on warm days. Enough for the fog to feel like something more than weather. The perfect facade was still standing. But now, people had started to see the cracks in the plaster. The Whitmore house, with its red brick walls softened by ivy and meticulously tended roses, had long been admired by the townspeople. But no one saw the truth beneath the surface. Behind the house, where the public never ventured, lay the secret heart of Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore's activities. A place that had grown methodically, like a garden designed not for beauty, but for concealment. The back garden stretched across nearly 2 acres, enclosed by high wooden fences and dense hedges. It was segmented with flower beds, paths of crushed gravel, and rows of ornamental shrubs. To the casual eye, it appeared a sanctuary, a place of peace and careful cultivation. Eleanor's skill as a gardener was evident everywhere. Roses climbed trellises in perfect spirals, tulips and daffodils bloomed in vivid colors, and the air was rich with fragrance. It was a garden that invited admiration. What people could not see were the irregular depressions, subtle mounds in the soil, and slightly darker patches of earth. Each one marked a child who had departed from the Whitmore household. Thomas had studied the terrain with the precision of an accountant, calculating drainage patterns, soil composition, and depth. He even timed the burials to coincide with heavy fogs or storms, using nature as an accomplice to their deeds. Eleanor's role was equally calculated. Her nurturing gestures, feeding, bathing, and dressing the children, were part of the deception. She provided a sense of comfort, a fleeting paradise, before their lives were ended. Her journal described the children with the cold detachment of a botanist recording the traits of newly discovered plants: hair color, eye color, height, habits, and moods. But the entries also contained a clinical determination of their fate. A notation such as "Clara is restless. Plan accordingly" would later accompany a burial beneath the roses she had spent weeks tending. Thomas and Eleanor worked in tandem, their routines as precise as clockwork. By day, they were the epitome of Victorian respectability. Eleanor entertained visitors, escorted children to church, and donated generously to charity. Thomas continued his meticulous accounting and occasional social appearances. But by night, the garden became a carefully orchestrated scene of horror. Lanterns cast dim light on freshly turned soil. Tools were cleaned and returned to their proper places. Each burial was executed with cold deliberation. Despite their efficiency, there were occasional risks. Rain could wash away markers. Soil could collapse. On more than one occasion, Thomas had to return to a freshly filled grave to adjust the earth, ensuring that no mound drew attention. He placed small stones over the soil, disguised as decorative elements, and planted flowers strategically to mask the subtle depressions. Only he and Eleanor knew the truth beneath the blooms. It was in this garden that the Whitmores' true understanding of life and death became horrifyingly clear. To them, the children were not individuals but variables, data points in an experiment of control and concealment. Eleanor wrote in her diary, "Little Grace is spirited, difficult to manage, must be resolved soon." The next night, the notation "resolved" appeared beside her name, a euphemism for something far more sinister. Thomas, for his part, treated the act as a calculation, a step in a logistical sequence, a problem to be solved efficiently. The neighborhood's ignorance was essential to their continued success. Victorian society often idealized the appearances of respectability and virtue, particularly among women. Eleanor's role as a devoted caregiver and gardener provided the perfect cover. Thomas, with his respectable profession and polite demeanor, discouraged suspicion. Even those who felt unease were hesitant to confront them. The system itself, a society structured by hierarchy and reputation, provided protection to the Whitmores, masking their crimes in plain sight. Yet, despite their careful planning, the garden carried the weight of its secrets. The soil was unnaturally fertile, nourished in ways that neighbors could not guess. Roses grew larger, tulips bloomed brighter, and the air seemed unusually fragrant. Locals admired Eleanor's green thumb, unaware that the richness of the earth came from something far darker than compost or manure. Every plant was nourished by hidden horrors, a grotesque paradox of life blooming over death. By late spring, the number of children who had entered and left the Whitmore home silently grew into a small, unmarked cemetery beneath the flowers. Each grave was shallow, carefully concealed, and documented only in Eleanor's journal. The garden, once a symbol of care and beauty, had become a stage for their cruelty, a haunting reflection of the Whitmores' dual existence, charm above ground, horror below. Even the few who had begun to sense something unusual could not articulate it. Fog, shadows, and social etiquette shielded the Whitmores from scrutiny. The garden, though meticulously cultivated, whispered of the terrible truths hidden beneath its beauty. And as Eleanor walked among her roses, lantern in hand, her diary in the other, she recorded each day with the same clinical precision that had begun this descent into darkness. Every bloom was a cover, every stone a marker, every shadow a silent witness. Beneath the beauty of Harrogate most admired garden lay an unimaginable secret, a quiet, methodical horror that no one would discover for years to come. By the summer of 1865, the whispers in Harrogate had grown into a faint murmur of concern. Nothing was overt. No formal complaint had been lodged, no one dared to accuse the Whitmores outright, but a subtle unease had begun to seep through the town. People noticed the patterns, children arriving at the Whitmore household, flourishing briefly, and then vanishing. At first, the explanations provided, work placements, distant relatives, charitable adoptions, were accepted without question. But repetition breeds suspicion, and even the most careful deception cannot endure indefinitely. It was William Hartley, a young and conscientious government inspector, who first became aware of the anomalies. Hartley had recently been appointed to the new Rural Oversight Initiative, tasked with monitoring living conditions in isolated towns across the county. His duties were largely administrative, checking sanitation, housing standards, and food quality, yet he had an acute awareness of social subtleties. He noticed the Whitmores during his routine inspections of the area, initially drawn by the house's impeccable reputation. On the surface, they were paragons of virtue, Eleanor's refined manners, Thomas's impeccable dress, and the garden's meticulously maintained beauty all suggested a family above reproach. But Hartley was trained to notice what others overlooked. During his first visit, he observed Eleanor speaking to a small group of parishioners. She smiled, handed a child some sweets, and reassured worried neighbors about their new charges. Yet there was something in her movements, a subtle stiffness, a careful modulation of tone, that seemed almost performative. Thomas, meanwhile, remained at the edge of the group, his eyes scanning the street and the house's perimeter, as if anticipating a threat that no one else could see. Hartley returned on several occasions over the following weeks, ostensibly to continue routine inspections. During these visits, he paid careful attention to the children. They were well-fed, neatly dressed, and outwardly content. But Hartley noticed subtle signs of unease. A child flinching at a sudden sound, another hesitating before approaching the house, a few avoiding eye contact. These small observations, taken individually, could be dismissed. Taken together, they began to form a troubling pattern. The tipping point came one foggy evening in late July. Hartley had arrived unannounced to check the Whitmores' sanitation practices. Eleanor greeted him with the same warm politeness as always, ushering him into the house and offering tea. Thomas lingered silently in the background. Hartley began his inspection, moving from kitchen to pantry, noting cleanliness, food storage, and water supply. Everything appeared exemplary. Yet his instincts were unsettled. There was a faint, lingering odor, something organic but indistinct, faintly metallic. It was subtle enough that most would ignore it, but Hartley could not. He decided to examine the garden, requesting Eleanor accompany him as she often did during inspections. As they walked along the gravel paths, she explained the layout: flower beds, irrigation channels, ornamental shrubs. Her voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. Hartley's eyes, however, were drawn to irregularities in the soil. There were slight depressions in places where no plants should have caused them. Small stones, placed at careful intervals, glinted in the fading light. Eleanor noticed his scrutiny and smiled. "Just part of the landscape design," she said. "I like the paths to have a rhythm, a pattern." But Hartley's experience in the field had taught him to trust patterns over appearances. His mind replayed the missing children he had catalogued during previous visits. Something about the garden felt unnatural. The soil was too dark, too rich in certain places. The air seemed heavier. And then he noticed it, a small indentation in the soil near a row of roses, partially obscured by Eleanor's careful planting. Rain had washed away the gravel that usually disguised it. Hartley crouched, examining the ground with his hands. Beneath the soil, he felt something rigid. Eleanor's smile faltered, just for an instant, enough to alert Hartley. She offered a quick explanation. "Perhaps a tree root, Mr. Hartley. These old gardens are full of surprises." But the inspector was already suspicious. His curiosity, sharpened by training and intuition, could not be stilled. This moment marked the beginning of the end for the Whitmores' carefully constructed world. Hartley began keeping detailed notes, documenting children's arrivals and departures, recording the peculiarities of the garden, and compiling subtle inconsistencies in Eleanor and Thomas's accounts. He reached out discreetly to colleagues in law enforcement, though he had no concrete evidence, only intuition, observations, and the pattern of unexplained absences. Even as Eleanor and Thomas continued their charade of respectability, the cracks in their facade were becoming impossible to ignore. The garden, once a symbol of life and beauty, had started to betray them. Every carefully planted flower and polished path could no longer conceal the invisible weight of their crimes. And Hartley, patient and methodical, was slowly assembling the mosaic of truth, one observation at a time. In the Whitmore house, life carried on as usual. Children laughed and played, unaware of the growing scrutiny. Neighbors admired the roses, unaware that they thrived upon secrets. Yet somewhere deep in the fog-laden corners of Harrogate, the quiet tremor of discovery began to ripple, subtle, almost imperceptible, but inevitable. The Whitmores had built a world of control and deception, but no fortress of cruelty could withstand the persistence of a careful observer. The fog that settled over Harrogate that October was thicker than usual, curling through the streets like smoke, muffling sounds, and blurring the edges of reality. William Hartley, the young inspector, felt a weight in the air as he approached the Whitmore property. His notes had grown meticulous over the past months. Every child's name, date of arrival, and date of departure, subtle irregularities in Eleanor's accounts, anomalies in Thomas's movements and routines. There was no direct evidence yet, but a pattern had emerged, and intuition whispered of a truth darker than anything he had encountered before. Hartley had requested permission to conduct a more thorough inspection of the property. Eleanor, ever polite, did not refuse outright, though there was tension beneath her calm exterior. Thomas, standing behind her, shifted uneasily from foot to foot, a slight flush coloring his otherwise composed demeanor. They both knew that an official inspection, even under the guise of routine oversight, could threaten everything they had carefully constructed. The inspector began with the house, examining every room, cupboard, and floorboard. Everything was orderly: polished floors, clean linens, neatly stacked supplies. The children present were well-dressed and seemingly cheerful, a facade that Eleanor maintained with precision. Hartley noted the discipline and apparent contentment, but the absence of certain children, documented in his notes and unaccounted for in the house, gnawed at him. It was when they stepped into the garden that the first undeniable signs of the Whitmores' duplicity appeared. Eleanor offered to guide Hartley along the winding paths, explaining her planting techniques, the composition of the soil, and the arrangements of her flowers. The roses, tulips, and daffodils were indeed extraordinary, their blooms unusually vibrant and fragrant. But Hartley's attention was drawn to the patterns in the earth itself: subtle depressions, darker patches of soil, and oddly placed clusters of stones. They were too uniform, too deliberate to be natural. Eleanor noticed his scrutiny and smiled, a little too quickly. "I do love order," she said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "Even the smallest details of the garden are carefully planned." But Hartley's experience in the field, and his growing unease, would not let him accept this at face value. Kneeling by one of the subtle mounds near the rose bushes, he brushed aside some loose soil with gloved hands. There it was, a small skeletal hand protruding from the earth, partially exposed by recent rain. Hartley's stomach tightened, but he did not falter. Eleanor's expression flickered, shock, irritation, and panic in rapid succession, before she regained her composure, murmuring something about a dead animal. Thomas moved closer, tense, his hand twitching as though ready to intervene. But Hartley's resolve did not waver. He summoned the local constable, and the two men began to carefully dig at the site. What they uncovered next was a horror that defied immediate comprehension. Beneath the surface lay a small child, clothed in garments that matched descriptions of missing children in Hartley's ledger. The shallow grave had been carefully covered, flowers planted above to mask any disturbance. Nearby, other depressions revealed more, small skeletons, each with fragments of clothing or personal items, all meticulously catalogued in Eleanor's diary. The garden that had once been admired for its beauty was revealed as a clandestine cemetery, each blossom hiding a grim truth. The shock rippled through the town as news spread. The Whitmores, once considered paragons of virtue and charity, were confronted with evidence that could not be denied. Eleanor's composure crumbled under scrutiny. She alternated between feigned ignorance and confessions, often in the same breath. Thomas, always the methodical planner, attempted to flee the scene but was apprehended within a few miles of the property. Their carefully constructed facade of respectability had collapsed entirely. Hartley continued to document the site meticulously. Each skeleton was exhumed with care, preserving clothing fragments, hair, and small belongings that Eleanor had retained, trophies of her cruel attention to detail. The process revealed not just the scale of the atrocities, but also the chilling precision with which they had been carried out. Each child had been carefully selected, observed, and ultimately disposed of with an almost professional efficiency. The Whitmores' actions revealed a duality that shocked even the most seasoned authorities. Eleanor had created a world of nurturing that masked systematic cruelty. Thomas had applied rational, calculated methods to murder and concealment. Together, they had exploited societal blind spots. the invisibility of orphaned and impoverished children, the unquestioned respect for appearances, and the reluctance of neighbors to suspect wrongdoing, to orchestrate a reign of terror hidden in plain sight. By the end of that first day of excavation, it was clear that Harrogate had been harboring a darkness few could have imagined. The garden's beauty, once a source of admiration, was now a testament to the Whitmores' capacity for deception and horror. The town, long lulled into complacency by appearances and social norms, was forced to confront the terrifying reality: evil had existed behind the most ordinary of masks, and it had thrived because no one had dared to look too closely. The uncovering of the garden marked the beginning of the legal and societal reckoning. Evidence, once meticulously hidden, now stood exposed, and with it came the unraveling of a life built on lies, manipulation, and cold-blooded murder. The Whitmores had miscalculated. Even the fog, the garden, and society's complacency could not protect them from the persistence of a determined observer. The trial of Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore became the most sensationalized event Harrogate had ever witnessed. News of the case spread rapidly, carried by letters, newspapers, and word of mouth. Citizens who had once admired the couple for their charity now recoiled in disbelief at the revelations of systematic child murder hidden behind a veneer of respectability. The courtroom, a modest structure with polished wooden benches and tall windows, became a stage for the darkest spectacle the town had ever encountered. Eleanor was the first to appear before the judge. Her demeanor had changed from the confident, composed woman who entertained neighbors and parishioners with ease. Now, she appeared fragile, her shoulders hunched, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a handkerchief. Yet there was still a glint of calculation in her eyes, a flicker of detachment that unsettled those who looked too long. Thomas, by contrast, entered with a measured calm, his face unreadable, as though he were analyzing the proceedings as another set of variables in a complex problem. The prosecution presented evidence meticulously collected by William Hartley and the local constables. Eleanor's journals were submitted, each page a chilling testament to her methodical observation and recording of the children who passed through their home. Names, ages, arrival dates, and the euphemistic word, departed, were laid bare, revealing the horrifying truth of their fate. Clothing fragments, locks of hair, and small personal belongings were presented as corroborating evidence, demonstrating the scale and premeditation of the Whitmores' crimes. Witnesses from the parish and neighboring families recounted the pattern of disappearances, the brief appearances of children who seemed happy yet vanished without trace, and the unnerving precision with which Eleanor and Thomas maintained the appearance of virtue. Even those who had long admired the Whitmores struggled to reconcile their memories of kindness with the evidence of atrocity now before them. Hartley testified, recounting his meticulous inspections, the subtle inconsistencies he had observed, and the moment the first skeletal remains were uncovered in the back garden. Eleanor attempted to defend herself, claiming that she had acted out of a misguided sense of mercy, that the children had been taken in by better families when circumstances demanded it. But her explanations faltered under scrutiny. The judge and jury were struck by the methodical nature of the killings, the deliberate concealment, and the cold detachment displayed in her writings. Every attempt to frame the acts as benevolent or accidental was dismantled by the incontrovertible documentation and physical evidence. Thomas's defense was even weaker. He had attempted to flee after the first graves were discovered, a fact that demonstrated consciousness of guilt. His testimony, when he chose to speak, was clinical and detached, describing his actions in terms of logistics, soil conditions, and rotations, as if discussing bookkeeping rather than human lives. The jury, horrified, found little in his testimony that suggested remorse or justification, only calculated rationalization of murder. The verdict, when it came, was swift. Thomas was sentenced to death by hanging, his execution scheduled for the winter following the trial. Eleanor, though found guilty of identical crimes, received a sentence of life imprisonment. The court's decision reflected contemporary views of gender and culpability, the prevailing belief that a woman might be led or influenced by her husband, yet the severity of her crimes ensured she would never walk free. Both sentences sent shockwaves through the town, igniting debates about morality, justice, and the social structures that had allowed such horrors to occur undetected. In the aftermath, Harrogate struggled to reconcile its past. The Whitmore property was seized and later sold, the house demolished, and a new residence built in its place. Yet even decades later, locals whispered of strange occurrences, flowers that refused to bloom, patches of earth that remained barren despite careful cultivation, and faint echoes of laughter carried on the wind, a haunting reminder of the children who had never grown up. The case had profound societal impact. Adoption procedures and child care oversight underwent reform, with stricter verification of guardians, regular inspections, and careful documentation of children's whereabouts. Victorian England, long enamored with appearances and social hierarchies, had been forced to confront the vulnerability of its most defenseless members and the consequences of systemic negligence. The children lost to the Whitmores, many of whom remain unidentified, became more than victims in a sensational story. Their lives, truncated and stolen, highlighted the fragility of the social systems designed to protect them. Modern historians and criminologists continue to study the Whitmore case, analyzing psychological patterns, societal blind spots, and the mechanisms that allowed two people to conceal systematic evil behind an impeccable facade. Eleanor died in prison 15 years later, never expressing true remorse. Thomas met his end at the gallows, his execution attended by a somber crowd who had once admired him. The garden, once a symbol of life, now stands metaphorically as a warning: beauty and virtue can mask unspeakable darkness, and society's blind trust can be weaponized by those with malevolent intent. Harrogate, and the broader society that enabled the Whitmore's crimes, was forever changed. The story remains a stark reminder that vigilance, scrutiny, and compassion are not only moral imperatives but essential safeguards against the most calculated forms of human cruelty. In memory of the children, the legacy of the Whitmores serves as a warning: evil does not always announce itself, it often hides in plain sight, cultivated behind polite smiles, beautiful gardens, and the pretense of respectability.